Welcome to another episode of the RotoWire NBA show. Most of you probably listening to this on Wednesday, October 21st. You might be watching it on the RotoWire YouTube channel, might be listening to it in our podcast feed or on Dash Radio's NBA channel. I'm Nick Whalen, joined as usual by my assistant NBA editor, Alex Barutha. Alex, we've now had more than a full week since the conclusion of the NBA season. How has your nightly habits changed when you don't have basketball that you're essentially obligated by your job to be watching? Not that you wouldn't anyway, but what have you been doing the past week?
Oh man, mostly just video games, honestly. I have a crippling addiction to video games, and lack of NBA just fuels that even more.
NBA was cutting into your video game time?
Yeah, that's basically how it goes. How about you?
Not video games. My roommate's a big gamer. He's been kind of counting down the days for the PS5 to arrive. So
Okay.
I think I'm going to be kind of grifting off of him to give that a try. But no, I mean, we've talked about this on the pod before. I'm still working with an Xbox 360. So every now and then, based on whatever season it is, I'll kind of get a 2 or 3 week itch to start an NCAA football dynasty or an NBA 2K dynasty. But I've kind of found that I lose interest fairly quickly. So I've done the unthinkable and actually watched a lot of baseball in the last week. There's been a lot of football on, so that's been nice. But I will say, as much as I love the NBA, as much as you love the NBA, and we did get a 4-month break without games essentially, but there is always a period after the season where I'm a little bit relieved. And normally this comes midsummer, so it's kind of perfect. You can go away for a week, do stuff on the weekends, not really worry about it, but there is always a period where I'm a little bit relieved that, you can come home from work, or in this case, walk out of my bedroom from work and just kind of do whatever you want and not have a TNT doubleheader that you feel like you have to be tuned into.
Right. Yeah, that feeling lasts for a month usually for me.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, when is summer league again? And I'm back to wanting, some random no name, the 14th guy on a summer league roster. I'm like, is he actually good?
Yeah. Well, and then, you and I went to summer league last year, and I would say you lasted a little longer than I did. By halftime of the first game we watched, I was pretty much ready to head back to, to the hotel or back to the pool. I think we watched, was it Knicks? I think it was Knicks Grizzlies with no Ja Morant, and Mitchell Robinson playing 10 minutes, and the night that was just about it.
Well, it's tough when you're in Vegas because you start seeing a lot of Kevin Knox, and you're like, I could be at the pool right now.
Speaking of Kevin Knox, did you see that Obi Toppin report today?
No.
So I mean, report is generous. I don't know where this came from, but apparently in an interview, Toppin said that he's somebody asked him how he's just been preparing for the draft during this kind of weird, uncertain period. He said he's been playing a lot of pickup basketball and picking the brain of NBA players like Kevin Knox.
Oh God.
I sent that to James Anderson, and he right away was like, somebody else's agent must have put this out, to try to leak and get some bad pub for Toppin.
Apparently, yeah, because that's about the last name you would want. It would be I picked the brain of Alexis Ajinça, and
I think what's worse, having that quote come out or picking up a DUI a week before the draft?
I don't know, honestly. Yeah. I don't know what would tank your stock more.
Yeah, equally damaging. Scouts are concerned about who he's surrounding himself with. So let's dive into a few news items before we get into our main topic today, which will basically be just kind of an offseason preview, more or less, for the 14 teams that, for some of these teams we haven't seen since March. So we'll go through all the teams that did not make the playoffs and just kind of do a reset and survey the landscape for each of those. But let's start with the Pacers, who very quietly hired a new coach on Tuesday, Nate Bjorkgren. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Never heard of this guy at all. Not a lot of people have. We were talking off air. Normally, we're not the most clued into assistant coaching circles by any means, but usually you kind of know. There's a group of 5 to 10 assistants whose names you hear jump around for 2 or 3 years, and eventually those guys work their way up. Much like Nick Nurse, for whom Bjorkgren has worked in the past. He was an assistant for Nick Nurse when Nick Nurse coached in the G League. Assistant for Toronto as well. So, as we're seeing, this is a trend usually for whatever team is having success. You often just see those assistants start to be picked off, and everybody wants to be the new Toronto. But what was your first reaction when you saw the Pacers go in a direction I don't think a lot of people, at least publicly, thought would be their pick.
Yeah, I felt like this maybe signaled a rebuild or like acknowledgement that kind of Oladipo wants to leave and they may need to change the team, because you're going from Nate McMillan, who I know he had a bad playoff record, which the Pacers very blatantly included in their press release saying that he was no longer the coach of the team. You go from that to hiring someone who's unproven, relatively unknown. And I just think it kind of signals like they're ready to do something different. And that it would be surprising if both Oladipo and Miles Turner were back. And, you know, Pacers aren't really a team to full scale rebuild, but they're a little bit backed into a corner right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've cooled off a little bit on the Miles Turner rumors. I think it's seeming like more and more likely that maybe Oladipo moves on. But the bottom line is, if you're trying to win the NBA title in 2021, you probably don't hire Nate Bjorkgren. You probably you either keep Nate McMillan or you go with someone who is more of a household name, somebody who maybe has relationships with players on this team, somebody who's more of a veteran. Like this, like you said, this kind of reeks of a, you know, kind of a rebuilding type of hire. And as you alluded to, Indiana is one of those teams that doesn't always like to embrace a full rebuild, or really can't afford to necessarily in that market. But I mean, again, if you're a veteran like Oladipo and, you know, you're kind of in your prime, or maybe, you know, due in part to injuries, kind of nearing the end of that prime, I don't think a hiring like this, you know, really galvanizes you to want to stay in Indiana, you know?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And they still have, I'm sure they'll still be competitive even if they trade Oladipo. I mean, they still have Malcolm Brogdon. Turner is kind of up in the air at this point, but they've locked Sabonis in, who's kind of a floor raiser as a player. TJ Warren looked good in the bubble. You know, their bench is still awful, but maybe Aaron Holiday will come along more. They're still going to be interesting, I think. And if they trade Oladipo, they'll get something good back, presumably. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is, I don't know. I think they're just trying to do something new, which I can understand. Like, I don't know. I mean, also, how many people, like, would Ty Lue want to coach the Pacers? Like, what was the market like, you know?
Right. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I think there were just other assistants. You know, like Darvin Ham is one of the guys that's been mentioned year after year, and I think that would have been less surprising. I think there just wasn't a lot of knowledge that Bjorkgren was really this close to getting a head coaching job. You made a good point about Oladipo, though. Like, they're not in a position, and especially with Oladipo now arguably being, like, this past year, he was their like third or fourth best player, you know, coming back from the injury, and they were still, you know, the fourth seed in the Eastern Conference. Trading Oladipo, one, you know, you're going to get some pieces back. Those could be young pieces, those could be picks, whatever they're going to be. They're going to help you, whether it's this year or next year. And two, he's not the type of star that you get rid of and all of a sudden the entire team context changes and you have nothing left and you have no choice but to rebuild. You still have Brogdon, you still have Turner, like you said, you still have Warren. I think in the Eastern Conference, like, even if they trade Oladipo and were to go for a more youth-oriented package or picks-oriented package, there's a case to be made that Indiana is still in that group of teams that you would pencil in as a likely playoff team, just because of those guys that we mentioned. Like that three of Warren, Brogdon, and Miles Turner, like, none of those guys are likely all-stars, but they're better than the top three, you know, on the Magic or the Hornets, or, you know, potentially even the Wizards, you know, depending on how those players shake out. So I do feel like Indiana still has a relatively high floor.
Yeah, and they weren't, I mean, he was not, you know, 100% healthy when he played, but they were only 11-8 when he played, and they were 45-28 overall. So obviously they played at a better rate when he wasn't on the court. So even if he's just not there at all next season, there's no reason to think that they couldn't still be like the fifth seed in the East.
Right. All right. Looking at the Western Conference, two teams that came up short in the Western Conference playoffs, both in round two. We'll start with the Rockets, who Tillman Fertitta apparently goes on CNBC once a week to just talk about whatever. And this week he talked about the Rockets and fairly emphatically said that they're not going to blow things up. Said basically what you would expect. I mean, I wouldn't read too far into this, but you know, he said he likes the Harden Westbrook core. They're not going to, you know, aggressively attempt to move off of that. I don't know how much I believe that. I think, you know, this is clearly an owner who has interest in, I don't know if I'd say meddling, but having influence in how the team makes roster decisions. I understand kind of wanting to see it through. You know, Russell Westbrook was injured in the playoffs, you know, missed half of that first round series against OKC. I ultimately don't think that's what precluded the Rockets from winning the NBA title by any means. I don't think they're all that close to winning the title. But at the same time, I also don't feel like they're in that situation where you're backed into a corner and you look at that roster and say, man, they have to move one of those guys. I don't have a huge issue, I guess, if they at least want to go into next season and try it again. Maybe at the deadline you reassess, maybe next offseason you reassess, but I don't think it's absolutely insane to keep this roster together and try to make improvements on the margins.
I agree. I mean, that's why they hire a new coach, right? That's the
Right.
first thing you do before you potentially shake up a roster that you are just unsatisfied with. And I don't, a lot of general managers would go on TV and say the same thing about their team, even if they were planning to blow it up behind the
Right.
scenes. It's just GM speak, or owner speak, I should say.
Yeah. Right. If the owner goes on CNBC and says, yeah, well, I think we'll probably blow it up, like, you really just can't do that. You really can't.
He's not going to go be like Westbrook for Kevin Love. Who says no?
Yeah, right. I don't even know if he can legally say that.
I don't think he can, but I'm sure they wouldn't be able to find him enough for it to matter.
Right.
I agree. We'll see what happens with the new coach. If they're the fourth seed again, that's probably fine for them. They're still going to be a fringe title contender. No matter how down people are on them this season, they're still going to be a fringe title contender.
Yeah, kind of right where they've been for the last 5 or 6 years at this point. Stephen A. Smith, who I love, like Stephen A. chooses 2 or 3 times per year to break news. He'll go months at a time without breaking any news.
Yeah.
And then just kind of drop these like Stephen A. bombs out of nowhere. And he's the one who's credited with reporting that Kawhi Leonard, quote, has privately clamored for the Clippers to upgrade their point guard position, aka probably move on from Patrick Beverley, who, I always thought, like, to me, as someone who, was kind of rooting for the Lakers this past year, it's like I was not rooting for Patrick Beverley, but he's one of those guys who, when he's playing against the team you're rooting for, you're just like, I absolutely hate this guy, but kind of in the Marcus Smart category, but you'd also want him on your team. Like I would have loved for him to be the Lakers point guard and have that kind of dog on your roster. So I mean, it's not like Kawhi came out and said, I don't want to play with Patrick Beverley, but there's kind of more and more evidence. There was a story in The Athletic last week. There was another story at the end of the season, right after they lost to Denver, where it kind of seems like there's this divide between Kawhi being on an island, being his own guy, Paul George kind of being the other superstar, and then the old Clippers guard of, Lou Williams, Pat Beverley, Montrezl Harrell, guys who were there for those last couple of seasons when they were a little bit more of a scrappy type of team, and feeling like everything kind of changed around them. I don't know. I mean, I'm just surprised. To me, Patrick Beverley seems like the type of point guard you would want to play with, especially if you're a guy like Kawhi who's so good defensively. The effort that he brings on that end specifically, it's just a little bit surprising. But at the same time, when Kawhi Leonard says something like this, I think it in a lot of ways compels the Clippers to at least survey the market.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's strange because you figure, I know they don't have like a traditional point guard who's going to handle the ball, but I thought Kawhi wanted the ball in his hands, and then if not, there's Paul George, and there's also Lou Williams is still on the team. So I'm not really sure. Also, their offense was still ahead of their defense this season. They were a better offensive team. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if he just wants to completely go all in on offense. And I mean, yeah, this could be something like you were saying, where there's signals that there's kind of the old Clippers and the new Clippers, and they're trying to kind of box out the the old guys and send them somewhere else. Because Harrell could easily be gone this season in free agency. It wouldn't surprise me if they tried to dump Lou Williams, and then Patrick Beverley could easily, you could try to trade him for whoever else. Mm-hmm. So if they look completely different next season, again, that wouldn't be surprising because they fired Doc Rivers, and Steve Ballmer has been extremely aggressive since he bought the team.
This Kawhi quote reminds me of things that LeBron has said over and over throughout his career. Everywhere he goes, it's we need more playmaking. Like I don't want to have to do everything. And then what happens, whether there's playmaking or not, LeBron brings the ball up the court every single time. He literally played point guard all season on a team that had Rajon Rondo. So I think it's, in theory, it sounds great to say I would like to take some plays off, but then when you're actually in the game, it's a lot harder to actually do. But Beverly makes, he makes north of $13 million next year, and that escalates up to $14.3 million in 21-22. Not that that's not tradable, but I think he is a player that when you start to look at the numbers, like his reputation as a defender far exceeds the type of production he's given you, and he's also been banged up these last couple of years. He's getting up there in age. Like I don't think that's there will be teams that want Patrick Beverley, but I don't think that's like the most appealing contract to take on. Whereas Lou Williams goes into next year as an $8 million expiring.
Right. And I think I always viewed Lou Williams as like way older than Patrick Beverley, but Patrick Beverley's only a year younger. Like he's 32 and he's a very specific type of player where he's a floor raiser. You can't put him on like Charlotte and you can't put him on, San Antonio or something. Like he has to go to a team that already has like established good offensive players who just need some sort of bolster to their defense. And there's not that many teams that fit that mold necessarily.
Yeah, the Clippers, like most teams, in an uncertain cap environment, are going to be, their improvements are mostly going to come around the margins. I would be pretty surprised if they bring Harrell back, although it kind of remains to be seen how much money he lost himself in the bubble. It could be like a lot. It's now to the point where, like, who's going to get more money annually after this year, like Montrezl Harrell or Jeremy Grant? It's not crazy to think Grant, right? I don't know.
I don't know either. I think people still believe in that. I don't know, for like a smaller market, being able to have Montrezl Harrell just put up like 19 and 8 for you, someone will pay for that, right?
Looking at
someone
just wants Pistons.
That. Oh yeah, someone will gladly.
Cavaliers.
Someone will gladly take that.
Yeah. No, people always do. Teams. There's a reason Nick Batum is making $27 million or whatever it is this year. I don't think it would be a smart move for the Clippers at all. And I don't think it'll be a smart move for whoever does pick him up. But, if you're Harrell, you also have to just take the payday. This being his first real, kind of big-time NBA contract. Let's look at – we're gonna start at the absolute bottom. So I have our teams, our non-playoff teams, sorted from fewest to most wins. And it still feels weird to say this, but that brings us to the Golden State Warriors, who won 4 fewer games than both the Cavaliers and the Timberwolves this past season. That was a 15-50 record for the Golden State Warriors, who hold the number 2 pick in next month's draft. This is by far the most intriguing team, I think, on this list, just because they're the major outlier in that they're the one team that won 15 games this year and will also be trying to win the title next year and has a realistic chance to do so. Let's start, I guess, with Curry and Clay coming back. And I feel like you and I are aligned on Thompson in that the way he plays, his age, everything involved there. Like, I think we expect him to come back and pretty much look like himself. There's not a lot of concern there. There's some videos of him earlier this week playing in pickup games. He looked fine, moving well. At this point, though, how realistic is it that Stephen Curry comes back and gives us the type of season that I think a lot of people thought we would see last year before he got hurt, where, you and I were talking, like, could he average 35 a game? He's continued to improve while Kevin Durant was in Golden State, but never really got a chance to show it long term just because of Durant's presence. The last time we saw him without Durant, he averaged 30 a game, led the league in scoring. And then obviously he got hurt early and we never got to see that. But Curry is 32. He turns 33 in March. I think he was 6-1 to win the MVP. I'm not saying I hate it. I would never bet against Steph Curry, but even the season before, he missed 13 games. Season before that, he missed 31 games. The injuries have kind of always been a narrative for him, even though he was able to shake it in the middle of his career. But how realistic to you is it that Steph Curry comes back and is right in the middle of the MVP conversation right away?
I think it's still possible. He's had. By the time the season comes around again, he'll have had a lot of time off, and I think he'll be fresh. And the Warriors still do not have a bench. Their bench is awful. He's going to need to play a lot of minutes if they want to win. If they want to stay competitive in the West. I don't think they have any issue staying competitive in the West, but their bench is still really bad. And I think he'll be fresh. So I don't know, maybe not MVP. It's interesting if you get the right number, right? If it's like 8-1 or something like that, because you never know. He could average 30 a game again. Because it's been a long time since we have seen like the fully kind of like unlocked Steph Curry where they just let him do his thing and they like need him on offense, because it's been so long since we've seen him without Durant. So I'm still interested in that. And I think I'm really not that worried. at all.
I mean, we haven't seen him play with even Klay Thompson next to him since June of 2019. Like it has been a very long time since we've seen Steph Curry play in a competitive basketball game that matters. I mean, it was even before he got hurt. It was clear in like the first 3 games of the year that was not going to go well without Durant, without Klay Thompson. I mean, I don't know if the Warriors make the playoffs even if Steph stays healthy last year. But when he turns 33, basically a month into when we think this season is going to start, I think there are some concerns. But I am with you. I mean, I think for me that number would have to get a little bit higher for MVP, just because I think the field is super deep. But at the same time, this is a guy who's won back-to-back MVPs and is certainly capable of it. What if you're the Warriors? What is your mindset with the draft now, less than a month away? Are you content to make that number 2 pick if you have to? And what we continue to hear from the Warriors is basically they want peak value. They're not going to settle for, all right, we'll send number 2 to Sacramento for like, I don't know, Harrison Barnes and a couple other decent pieces. I think I've heard people throw like Rashawn Holmes out there. Like they want to turn number 2 and Wiggins into a legitimate superstar and kind of get right back to where they were when they had Durant. One, how realistic is that? And two, if you're the Warriors, would you be willing to settle? If you were in charge of the Warriors, would you be willing to settle for filling out this roster, which even though you have healthy Steph, healthy Klay, healthy Draymond, the bench is not nearly what it was during those championship runs.
It's not. I think making the pick is okay because that player will play. And you have to have confidence in that pick because they are going to be on the court because they will need to be. I don't know how realistic it is to trade number 2 in Wiggins for someone. I don't know who exactly is available for that. Like, I don't know if Beal makes sense for that.
No.
Yeah. It's a tough deal because I think almost everyone's out on Wiggins. I'm sure there are still some teams that would be interested in giving him a shot, but I don't know. I mean, I've heard the option of trying to get Blake Griffin thrown out there. And maybe Detroit would take number 2 and Wiggins. But again, I don't know if Golden State wants to take on the contract with the injury risk.
Right.
So it wouldn't surprise me if they just ended up making the pick and just playing whoever they take.
If I was Detroit, I would take that deal in a heartbeat. And I love Blake. You and I love Blake. But I mean, even if he stays healthy for 82 games the next 2 or 3 years, however long he's under contract, does it mean anything? Do you even make the playoffs in both of those years? I don't know if you do. So I don't know. I mean, if I'm Golden State, that's just way too risky. Like I would rather, Buddy Hield is a worse player than Blake Griffin. But if I would rather like get a centerpiece deal with Buddy Hield and some other decent pieces than Blake Griffin and just, crossing my fingers that he stays healthy. To me, that's just way too risky for a team that has so much good in place already.
I agree. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And we also don't really know what they're going to do with their roster necessarily. Like, do they want a traditional center at all? Are they going to go completely small ball? Like, is Draymond is he 100% a center? Are they going to try to get a stretch big? Like if they keep Wiggins, what could they do there? So I don't know. They're a really interesting roster. I think they're in good shape no matter what they do because they have all the talent in the world, right? But they're just a really fascinating team, and this could be a turning point off season for them, no matter what they do.
I would say the only thing that worries me about their future is Draymond, because I mean, much like Steph, we didn't really get a great evaluation of Draymond this year, but I think he kind of got a pass from just about everybody because of who was around him. But this was not a great year for Draymond, and the year before it was also not a great year, and it's been a pretty steep decline, especially offensively, since that peak 2015-16 73 win season. And if he's not all world level defender and is now like a 30% 3-point shooter who at times doesn't even want to take them, like that's a pretty big hit, especially when Andrew Wiggins is something of a non-shooter. And if you're going to have at least one true center on the roster who you're comfortable playing maybe sometimes 15 to 20 minutes when you're playing the Lakers or the Clippers or the Nuggets. Like I don't think it's fair to ask Draymond to defend Anthony Davis for 40 minutes or defend Nikola Jokic for 40 minutes. Like they have to add somebody. And like you said, I don't know who that guy is. I mean, I think chances are, it could be Dwight. They could go back to a JaVale McGee type, maybe Tristan Thompson, somebody like that. And somebody threw out like Andre Drummond for number 2 in the Wiggins pick, and maybe if you're Cleveland, you'd have to send something back. I don't necessarily hate that idea. I mean, if Drummond can't succeed with the Warriors, I think at that point it's just clear that it's not going to happen anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I also think Kevin Love would be interesting for the Warriors.
Yeah,
it's kind of like a 4-5. I think he makes sense in their offense, right? He can shoot the 3. He's a great passer. He hasn't really been utilized as a passer over the past few years. I think that's some kind of become an underrated aspect of his game. So yeah. I would be interested in Love or Drummond, or honestly both. I'm not sure exactly how that would work with those 3 guys, but if you can get those 3 guys and then figure it out later, I don't think that's a bad move. Because I mean, the Cavaliers, they would take anyone, right? They'd probably take Wiggins. They would take the number 2, and they'd probably take
happily take number 2.
Yeah, and like Kai Bowman or whoever else is available.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric Pascal will probably have some interest from teams like that. Certainly teams like Cleveland that are just trying to throw as many darts as they can at this point. But speaking of the Cavs, let's move on to them. We don't have to get too far into like Love and Drummond deals because you just kind of hit on it. But this roster is just not good. It's not good. And I think in some ways they might have overachieved last season, which is not, saying a lot for a team that won 19 games. I mean, this was a bad roster. And for the second time since LeBron left, they've kind of been left high and dry. And it wasn't necessarily their fault either time because of how they were forced to rebuild the team. But unlike the last time LeBron left, they immediately hit the lottery on Kyrie Irving. That has not happened. Colin Sexton is not Kyrie Irving. Darius Garland, maybe even further from Kyrie Irving. Like, is there a single player on this roster who you would say, like, I for sure think this guy will be on the team in even like 4 years?
I think Sexton. I think they like Sexton and will probably try to keep him. He had a good year this year. 47% from the field, 38% from 3, 21 points a game. He's not really a point guard still. There's the chance he ends up being the Wiggins of point guards, right? But yeah, there's no one on this team who I think is someone that you lock your future into. I mean, I've heard, Kevin Porter had some moments, but again, that's like he played only 50 games, 20 minutes a game. Like, we didn't see that much from him. I mean, at least I think this roster is still at least interesting they have assets to trade now, at least, right? Every year that Kevin Love's deal gets closer to expiring, the more offers there'll be for him. Tristan Thompson, is he a free agent?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, that's tough for them because they probably could have traded him, right? You would think.
Let me double check on that, but I believe yes. I think teams were hoping that he was going to get bought out, right? So yeah, he is a free agent, and yeah, they opted not to buy him out. I think both the Lakers and the Clippers would have been in on him. He's a guy too that'll be interesting. I mean, he already has a title. So I wouldn't label him like a ring chaser necessarily, but I mean, he's almost 30. I don't think it would be crazy for him to maybe take a little bit less money, and whether that means not returning to Cleveland or not going to another bad team, maybe look to get to a contender. I am with you on Sexton to some degree. The numbers are good. Like you said, 47% from the field, 38 from 3, 85 at the line. For most second-year guards, that's pretty good, and you'd be pretty excited about it. But for whatever reason with him, there's just this general belief, and I didn't watch a ton of Cavs basketball last year, but like, if somebody's averaging 20 and with those shooting, with that kind of shooting efficiency in year 2, you should be more excited. And it kind of scares me that nobody seems to be all that optimistic. Like, I do get, and I don't use this term lightly, I get some Brandon Knight vibes from Colin Sexton. Some early, like when Brandon Knight came to the Bucks and had that year where it's like, is he maybe an all-star? The numbers are good, but then you see 3 assists, 3 rebounds. Like, the defense that was so great at the high school and the college level just hasn't really translated all that much. Like, I don't know. I'm not asking you for like a full diagnosis on Colin Sexton, but something is up that people, especially Cavs people, just don't seem all that excited about this guy.
It is a little strange, right? Yeah, I like the Brandon Knight comp. I think they're definitely similar players. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. It's tough because someone's got to score on this team. He's not a real passer. Brandon Knight wasn't a real passer either. Yeah, it is weird that nobody's excited about him. And I guess like it's the wrong, like if this was the rebuilding Lakers and Colin Sexton was scoring 21 points a game, people would be buying jerseys. I mean, he would be way more hyped than Kuzma ever has been. So maybe it's a product of the market, but so it's something worth monitoring, I would say.
All right, the Minnesota Timberwolves. I'm going to throw some Karl Towns numbers at you. And
Okay.
I think they're a team that I wouldn't say got a pass, but they got something of a pass because Towns missed so much time. But before Towns initially got hurt, they lost 11 of the last 14 games. Then when Towns came back, they lost 10 in a row and 11 out of 12. So he was 4-22 in the final 26 games that he played last season. You and I both like Towns. This is the first time he's ever really been injured. I don't think it's going to become a pattern. I just don't know that they've done anything to remedy the issues that have really always been there since Towns has been the centerpiece. Adding D'Angelo Russell is all well and good to keep a superstar happy, I guess. But at the same time, that superstar is kind of at the root of some of the major issues for this team. And I think they'll be fun to watch. Like those two, Malik Beasley, Jarrett Culver maybe gets better in year 2. They'll add another lottery pick. They'll be a fun team, but I really don't think this team has like any chance to make the playoffs next year.
It's going to be really tough for them. You start comparing them to even like Phoenix, and you're like, Phoenix is definitely better than them, right? It's rough. Do you want to guess how many players they ended up different players the Wolves started last season?
Started.
How many different players started for the Timberwolves?
I don't even know. Let's see. I will guess 16.
18 different players started for the Wolves last season. One of them was Noah Vonleh. So,
oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. So they had 24 players appear in a game for them last year.
Yep.
My Lord.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like out on D'Angelo Russell. I think he's good. I just don't know. He's not really doing anything on defense. Again, he's not a fantastic distributor. I think the idea that you can just run like their version of like a Jokic Murray pick and pop, pick and roll thing, I think that's probably what they want to do. And it's probably their only option because there's no one else on the team that can really do anything. So I'm intrigued by them, and I'm sure they'll put up insane numbers. Like they may be another one of those teams that's just every night, the over under for their games is like 230 because they just fire up shots early into possessions and they give up a ton of points. So I think they'll be an exciting team, but I don't really have faith in them being good.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And I love the Towns, Jokic, Russell Murray comparison. I actually really think that is accurate. I think they saw Denver do that and they're like, oh, we could totally do that. That's no big deal. That'll be easy. I'm looking at their schedule from last year. They had, I'm trying to count it up here, 13 games in which they allowed at least 130 points. 139 3 times. They allowed 142 in regulation to the Lakers, who were not exactly like throwing points up left and right. I just don't think the defense is going to be any better this year. I don't think they did anything to address that. I think sometimes when you have the opportunity to turn Andrew Wiggins into D'Angelo Russell, you just do it because that's the move. But I think like that's a move that like smart teams just probably don't make. They say it's lateral at best, and it's just on paper it's just such a bad pairing with Towns. But we'll see how it plays out. The Atlanta Hawks. I think this year is certainly not like a make it or break it year for Trae Young by any means, but I think it's at least going to tell us more about what you need to do to win games with him on your team. We talked last week about, if you're averaging 30, 9 assists, 4 rebounds, 1 steal, shooting 36% from 3 on very difficult looks, 44% from the field in year 2, a guy who's 6'1" and weighs like 175, like that's pretty damn good. And that resulted in a pretty terrible season, as was the case his rookie year. If they go like 25-57 this year, I don't know what the answer is at that point, because this roster is not that bad, right? I mean, it's at least capable to the point where they should contend for the 8th seed on paper. When you have a 30-point per game scorer, you have Clint Capella, you have John Collins. I don't know that it's like all that far off from, we talked about Phoenix in the West. Like man to man, like the Suns roster is better, but it's like Atlanta's isn't like that far of a cry, especially at the top. And I don't know. It's hard for me, I guess, to see them making a major leap because I just don't know where Trae Young goes defensively. He really doesn't have it's just kind of impossible for him to improve. And offensively, at least statistically, there's not a whole lot of room for him to grow, which seems crazy considering he's going into year 3. But it's not like he's going to come out and average 36 points and 13 assists all of a sudden next year.
Right. I think trading for Capella was a win now move. And so they have to have expectations to be a winning team next season. They have to feel very similar to how Chicago feels. I'm sure they're just in that tier where they really want to be able to get the 7th or the 8th seed in the East, and they probably feel like they're the most talented team that didn't make the playoffs last season, right?
Yeah, I think in the East for sure.
Yeah, it's between them and Chicago, in my opinion. So, and I would probably give the nod to Atlanta, but so for them, yeah, it's tough. If they're not a winning team, that's going to probably say something about Trae Young. I would say, or at least it's tough to say he's like not a winning player if he's putting up those numbers. Right. Because we've seen players before who play virtually no defense be able to, carry teams a really long way. So they have cap room, right? I think we talked about that last podcast where they might be able to still make a move for somebody and bolster their roster somehow. Right. So we should look out for them during the offseason to maybe try to get one more guy and really just go for it.
Yeah. And I think they're one of those dark horse teams for next year, 2022, appealing city, appealing young players. I think all it might take for them is to just maybe not even make the playoffs, but like just prove that they're somewhat close to attract whatever free agent might want to come play there. Because I think right now they're just a little too far away to realistically expect a player to ever like push their way to Atlanta. That's just not really in the cards. Right. The Detroit Pistons. I don't have a whole lot here. What do you have to say about the Pistons?
Not much, except that I think they're other than having Blake Griffin, they're the blankest slate in the league, right?
Salary wise, yeah, they're right up there.
Yeah. So I think they're interesting from that perspective where they can do anything, like from a roster perspective. They could try to do something crazy. They could go and they're the team that is the biggest candidate for a complete tank, like a legitimate process 2.0, because their roster is completely barren. They have no clear, again, other than Blake, their best player might be Christian Wood or Luke Kennard. If I'm looking at this roster correctly.
If Christian Wood even is on the team next year, yeah.
Yeah. So, they're in I guess Derrick Rose. I always forget about Derrick Rose, but they should trade him. There's no reason for him to be on this team anymore. Yeah, so
I think that's happening.
I don't really have a ton to say about them, except that they should just look to do the process and get kind of, that's I think it's their only option.
I think they should be the team that is looking to, maybe not go full process, but take on, money here and there. That's not going to hurt you long term. Somebody needs to free up space to make a signing. You're the team that takes, player X who's making $6 million or whatever. Just absorb them and pick up a protected first or whatever it might take. Like they need to be in asset stockpiling mode.
Yeah.
Because unlike a lot of these bad teams, they don't really have much other than their own picks. And, like you said, their only real salary on the books after this coming year is Blake Griffin's $39 million player option for 21-22. And if you can find a way to move that, it's a completely blank slate. The contrast to that, though, is you're located in Detroit, Michigan, and you're not clearing the books for Devin Booker, Karl Towns, and D'Angelo Russell to all come sign with you in Detroit. Yeah. Like, it's all well and good to have that cap space. I wouldn't want to spend it on Blake Griffin, but I don't know. Oftentimes for franchises like this, it just leads to you feeling like you have to spend money on pieces that you probably are paying too much for.
Yeah, which is why I think they should just do, like you said, and just take on money that nobody else wants. And this is actually maybe one of the best times in NBA history to do that, right? Because of the we don't know what's going to happen with the salary next season. Who even knows?
There are very few teams who are in the position to be able to do that.
Right, and they are, and especially if they can get rid of Blake Griffin and return salary that isn't that much. Yeah, they're in a really good spot to just kind of take advantage of that. And I think if they don't start doing that, then they are missing an insane opportunity. So. All
right, the New York Knicks. Speaking of teams with flexibility, for as much as we make fun of the Knicks, and everybody in the world makes fun of the Knicks. They're well positioned for 2021 and beyond. All those contracts, they basically signed an entirely new team last year and gave like everyone a 1+1 or a 2+1. So, you still have Randle, Portis, Gibson, Ellington, Payton, Barrett, Joakim Noah is still on the books this year. Ntilikina, Smith, Knox, Bullock, all those guys, Mitchell Robinson are all on guaranteed contracts, except for Bobby Portis, who does have a team option. All those guys are on the books this year, but much like Detroit, their only commitment right now beyond next season is Julius Randle at $19.8 million. I think there's a pretty good chance that before the start of this season, that money is thrown into a deal and he's out of there. So even though we've seen the Knicks do this like 5 times over the last couple of decades, everything is culminating towards some big free agency class and it never actually works out. I don't know. I mean, at least they'll be in position for it. There have been times in the past where they've so squandered their roster that when players have showed interest in coming there, it hasn't even been an option. So at least in New York, doing what the Pistons, what we're advising the Pistons to do is a little more appealing because there is that sliver of hope that someone will want to go play there. That's never really going to happen with Detroit. So New York, I mean, I think this season for the Knicks is going to end up looking a lot like last season. Even if they trade for Chris Paul, I have my doubts as to whether that's going to be enough to get them where they want to be, just because the pieces around him are not great. But I don't know. I would be looking to shed a lot of this money if I were them, and looking ahead to next year, and most importantly, playing Mitchell Robinson more than 18 minutes a game.
Ideally close to 40 minutes a game.
I don't see why not.
The most confounding part of all of this is Tom Thibodeau's their coach now.
That is true.
And I don't know why they would do that, other than again, it seems like they're trying to gear up to sign someone. I hear they're interested in Giannis, and Tom Thibodeau is clearly the guy. I just we saw, I think there's a hesitancy for these big market teams, LA, Boston, Chicago, New York. They don't want to rebuild because they figure they can just get free agents and they just want to do everything as quick as possible. But the Lakers did that successfully, right? They rebuilt successfully. The Clippers, what they have now, they got partially because they got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Montrezl Harrell, and they rebuilt pretty successfully. Boston kind of did it. I mean, they had an insanely quick rebuild, but look where they are now. Mm-hmm. And the more New York, they just refuse to rebuild, the more they just keep digging themselves into this insane hole that they're never going to get out of, and no one respects them as an organization, and it just keeps going and going. And they just have to fully commit, and but they aren't, because they hired Tom Thibodeau. And so I have no idea what's going on.
Losing the Williamson Morant lottery and then losing Durant and Kyrie within the span of a couple months, I think was a new low for the Knicks.
Oh yeah.
There's been some other lows, some notable lows, but that double whammy is as bad as it's gotten.
That almost put the nail in the coffin. I feel like, from like a news cycle perspective, about the Knicks. Like, yeah. I just don't, over the next 2 or 3 years, I just feel like they're not, like, there's only so much Knicks news cycle that I think can exist. And they've been in the news cycle even when they are relevant, but like, that was just, it's so bad now, and it's so bleak that it feels like it's not even worth our time talking about them. Like, it's.
And at the end of the day, like, I don't know, where do you stand on the Knicks? Like, do you feel bad for the Knicks? Do you want them to be good? I want them to be good. I think it would be really fun if they were good.
I would love for them to be good. I think it would be awesome, because anytime, like, there really is, when good games happen in Madison Square Garden, it actually is awesome.
Yes.
So I want them to be good.
There's no other team in the NBA that has that. Like, when the Lakers were bad, those games felt like the team was bad. Like, when the Knicks make their like 2 national appearances on TV for the year, it doesn't matter who they're playing. They're probably going to get killed. It feels like a big game because the crowd is in it like it's a big game. No other stadium matches that.
Yeah, and also the crowd like really still likes to see the other players do well, and the other teams' players love to play there.
Right.
So right now they're getting all the benefit of playing there a few times a year without actually having to deal with the organization itself.
All right, the Chicago Bulls. Is there a chance that Chicago can position itself to be a team that ends up being in play for big free agents next year? I feel like we keep hearing about Dallas, Miami, the Warriors as these teams that'll be there for Giannis and whoever else. Kawhi, LeBron could be a free agent. We'll see how many of those guys actually make it to market, but I don't necessarily see why Chicago couldn't be involved. One, for the city, the history of that franchise, and two, much like I said with Atlanta, like if they have a year this year where they outperform even the most optimistic expectations, and all of a sudden they're like the 6th seed in the Eastern Conference, and Zach LaVine looks like he's really good and might be, the ideal number 2, number 3 for a great team. You have these young players. Like, I think there's a pretty interesting combination of future flexibility. They have Thaddeus Young and Satoransky on the books for 2021, 22 for a combined 24. You can move those if you wanted. I think there's like just enough in place that if they play this next season correctly, I don't know that they'd be in play for Giannis necessarily, but I think they could be one of those teams that is able to return to prominence a little more quickly through free agency.
I think so too, but so much of it hinges on this next upcoming season. Yeah. Again, it's like so important for Billy Donovan to have a good year, for LaVine to kind of, I think, prove that he's a winning player. Wendell Carter and Lauri Markkanen need to stay healthy. That's been a concern for them. I like both of them. It's just they need to be on the court. Not sure what kind of developments Kobe White's going to make. It feels like they'd be kind of in the market for they would need like a forward or a center, because if you have LaVine and Kobe White in the backcourt, you're not going to be able to really get a guard unless you want to move one of those guys. But yeah, theoretically, I mean, they're a big enough market. They should be able to swing something. I know their ownership, like people haven't liked, so that's been a concern, but,
yeah. Well, I think it's almost been more the management, and they finally remedied that.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, because they could, again, they're a team I think could make the 8th or the 7th seed this year, depending on how things break. So when you're there with young players, then yeah, why not?
All right. Well, we're running somewhat short on time, so we might have to save some of these for later this week or maybe next week on Dash Radio. But the Washington Wizards, nonetheless, what has to happen for Brad Beal to remain on this roster for the entire season?
Legitimate playoff picture, right?
I think so. I mean, either that or some sort of promise, because it's not like he's expiring this year, or even next year. It's like he's under a relatively long-term deal. So his leverage, at least on paper, is not like all that great. I mean, if he picks up his player option, his contract goes through 2023. So the Wizards are under no obligation to trade him. I guess my question is, like, how dire is the situation? Like if they fall out of contention early on, do you think it would take him demanding a trade? I don't think Washington goes out of its way to shop him necessarily.
No, because John Wall is still on this roster for, again, same year, 23, and he is going to be owed $47 million that year. And they're now in a Blake Griffin situation. This is very close to a Blake Griffin Detroit Pistons situation, except that they actually still have Bradley Beal as their second best player instead of Derrick Rose or Luke Kennard or Christian Wood. And so it's Bradley Beal still also only 27, I think. He could be 28. He's either 20. Yeah, he's 27.
Okay.
So it feels like he's still kind of young. Like, it'd be different if he was 29 and it was way easier to sell to the fan base. Like, listen, by the time we're good again, he's going to be 33. But they could still be good again in 3 or 4 years. It'd probably take a miracle, but it could happen. And then he'd only be 30. Yeah. So I don't know.
Well, we'll see how quickly Mo Wagner is able to develop.
I don't know. I think, and they're probably going to lose Bertans. So I don't know. It's really tough for them. I would try to trade Beal and Wall, but I can understand why they want to keep them as well, because they can probably convince themselves they're an 8 seed team, even though I don't buy it. But
yeah, my only note on the Wizards is I read something this past week praising Rob Pelinka and just kind of making the case that he didn't get enough credit. Everyone doubted him, and one of the points that they brought up in Pelinka's favor is how he drafted and developed Isaac Bonga, who is now on the Wizards. Like, he was listed in like Pelinka's success stories. Like, I don't know if he's quite reached that point yet, personally. All right, let's go to the Charlotte Hornets. I feel like this team is in prime position to make a terrible signing this offseason. Like, just when Bismack Biyombo comes off the books, just when Nick Batum can maybe be waived or traded in his final season, like, they're going to re-up. They still have Batum and Zeller on the roster this season as their bad contracts. But the books are ready to take on like Fred VanVleet for $90 million or Bogdanovich, or maybe they could be the Montrezl Harrell team.
Maybe they could just Yeah, they could be the Pirtle Saric team, maybe. They just grab both of those guys.
Yeah.
20 million a year. Yeah, it's if they miss it, they're gonna miss out on Harrell, and then they're gonna be like, you know what, Jakob Pertl's probably like a 15 million a year guy, 35 minutes a game.
Like this is the only team that offered me more than 5 million a year.
Yeah. It's gonna be shades of the Luol Deng Lakers contract. It seems like they're in a position to make another bad signing, but they have a really good draft pick, and ideally they should just kind of stand pat and try to get rid of the expirings that are on their roster, and just keep rolling over these next few years and just try to keep building on their young core, which isn't horrible. They have a passable young core, surprisingly. A lot of that's propped up by Devontae Graham, but Bridges is still interesting. PJ Washington's interesting. Monk was good at the end of the year, so you add someone to that.
He's back from the weed suspension.
Yeah,
that'll be big. Charlotte, much like Detroit, to me, they've just kind of it feels like they've missed barely on a lot of recent picks. You know, like if Detroit just takes Donovan Mitchell instead of Luke Kennard, complete the whole entire scope. Like maybe we're not even talking about them as a non-playoff team. You know, and Charlotte's had some misses as well. They've missed on like virtually every pick that they've made since they became the Hornets. And that's kind of what it comes down to. I don't want to oversimplify it, but like you said, I mean, they're a team that holds a top 4 pick, and a team that could very well change its fortunes. If they miss on that one, like they have with some other recent picks, the cycle continues. If they hit on it, all of a sudden we view them completely differently. But considering the market that they're in, and much like Utah, you know, I just mentioned Mitchell, like they hit on Gobert late in the first round. You know, you hit on guys like that, your whole future changes. The Hornets aren't signing any franchise-changing players anytime soon. These are the type of opportunities as a franchise that you have to capitalize on when you have a pick like this, when you jump up in the lottery and you already have a few promising players. Like if they nail this pick, their whole future outlook is completely different.
I'd forgotten that they traded the pick that was Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for Miles Bridges in 2 seconds.
Big trade.
That is devastating.
Is that more egregious or less egregious than the Clippers having consecutive picks, taking SGA, and then instead of Michael Porter taking Jerome Robinson?
Yeah, that's insane. I mean, there were a lot of teams that passed on Michael Porter. I thought once the Knicks didn't take him,
that was the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, what are you doing?
I forget who went before him, but there were like a number. There was basically a straight line where it's like, all right, after this, it now becomes acceptable to take the risk on Michael Porter, and it was Knox or Porter, and they chose poorly, very, very poorly. And then it became, I mean, like I remember I was at the draft, and I'm sitting there talking to people like, oh no, there's no chance he makes it past the Clippers. They literally have 2 consecutive picks. They're a good team already. You have 2 picks. One of these you can just waste. If he never plays a game, it's not a big deal. Like it's just, I don't know. And the Clippers get a pass because they are good, and nobody talks about it. Just like the Nuggets get a pass for trading the Jamal Murray pick because they're also good. But man, both of those. I mean, imagine Michael Porter on the Clippers, or just having that asset. You know, what else you could have added to that team?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised when Orlando didn't take him at 6. I think that was the first time I was actually like surprised that they took Bamba instead of Porter.
Well, I was very pro Bamba.
Yeah,
that one is not looking great.
A lot of people were. And was the only reason Kevin Knox flew up the board was because he was sort of like Michael Porter, but just like younger with no injury history? Because I feel like he came out of nowhere, at least for me as someone who doesn't like grind the draft.
So he was a late riser as a prospect, but he was a top 10 player in the country unanimously, like when he got to Kentucky.
Okay.
The issue was he was a great football player in high school, and then he got too tall. Like he was a quarterback prospect, and then all of a sudden he was like 6'9".
Okay.
And I don't even know if he played his senior year. He basically had to stop playing because he was too tall. So like there's this belief that, oh, he's been in that football mentality. He's been training for football his whole life. You know, kind of like the typical, like, oh, he's only been playing basketball since his junior year. Like,
okay.
But in reality, he had been playing basketball. He just hadn't been playing it very well for that long. But yeah, I think that's the Kevin Knox story. I feel bad. We've now bashed him at the beginning, middle, and end of the podcast.
Is that going to be that should be the new go-to where it's like, well, he's playing out of position. He's actually a quarterback.
Try him at quarterback. Try a different sport. Who do you have more faith? Well, we'll end it on this. We have like 30 seconds left. Who do you have more faith will be a good NBA player, Mo Bamba or Kevin Knox?
Mo Bamba, I think.
With such conviction.
Mo Bamba's been like, I don't know. He's at least like he can play defense. right? We at least
So.
he's as good of a 3-point shooter as Kevin Knox, and he can play defense.
He runs very fast down the court.
Yeah.
Mo Bamba does. He just kind of sprints back basket to basket at this point. Yeah, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that.
That's okay.
That was a tough position to put you in
rough.
right at the end. But all right, we're out of time. We'll save New Orleans, Sacramento, San Antonio, Phoenix, and Memphis for our next episode, and then we'll do the same for the playoff teams as well. Thank you for listening to the RotoWire NBA show. We'll be back on Dash Radio next week.